Thank you for having me here. My poor friends and family always have to listen to my story, so it's nice to have a captive audience. So, as Barb was saying, I started as a camper at Keewaydin, which is based out of Lake Temagami, when I was 12. And my dad was a staff there, my brother was there, so it was very much in our blood to be canoe tripping that way. But at this time, when I started in 1999, it had been an all-boys canoe tripping camp for 106 years at that time. And the first year I went was the first year they started having girls. And so you can imagine that after 106 years of an all-boy canoe tripping camp, it was very traditional. Tradition is a very big thing there. And so for us to come in with new staff and new campers and to be accepted as doing it the Keewaydin way was pretty hard. So we had some rough patches to begin with. And I always really felt as I was a camper for those 5 years that we were always kind of trying to prove ourselves that we were doing it the right way. But fast forward 15 years later, and I still have yet to find a better thing to be doing with my summers. So I'm still with Keewaydin. I've been guiding there for about 10 years now, and the last 7 of those have been doing the long wilderness trips, so the 7-week-long trips with the oldest group of girls, and usually ending at the Hudson Bay. So when I was first doing these long trips, we did a lot of trips in northern Quebec on the Great Whale, ending at Pick. And these past few summers, we've been on the Severn and the Attawapiskat. And this past summer, we started at Windigo Lake and finished at York Factory. And so I'm thankful that Dave presented earlier and introduced York Factory. I promise I won't overlap too much, but there will be some interesting tie-ins. So the girls that come on these trips, the trips usually have 10 campers, and these girls are about 16 to 18 years old. And by the time they get to this long trip, they've usually been progressing through the camp for about 5 years. So not only are they very competent, but they're very passionate about canoe tripping and passionate about the Camp Keewaydin and really excited to be there. And they actually want a really hard trip. So what I worry more about making the trip too easy than making it too hard, because they really want to be challenged, and that's pretty cool to be leading a trip where the girls are that excited to be there and that competent. So this is a rough itinerary of our trip this past summer. It just gives you an idea of where we were, and I'll talk a little bit about the trip planning, but I mostly wanted to use this slide because it gives me an excuse to talk about my co-guide, Lauren. She couldn't be here, but she's here with her pictures because Lauren's a really passionate photographer. Most of our paddle breaks throughout the summer revolve around when Lauren's changing lenses or taking pictures. And Lauren was determined to get the perfect picture of lightning. And so I soon learned after working with her that if there was a storm in the middle of the night where all of us are hunkered down in our tents, and I would look over into the tent after waking up from the thunder, Lauren would not be there because she would always wake up before me, and she'd have her camera and be out of the tent, exposed to the elements, trying to get that perfect lightning picture. And I think she did pretty well with this one. A lot of the pictures in this presentation are courtesy of Lauren, so we can thank her for that. So this gives just a little idea of what our trip planning looks like. Lauren and I had wanted to do the God's River for years. We'd both read the book Canoeing with the Cree, which tells the adventure of 2 boys from Minneapolis who journey all the way up to York Factory. And we'd heard, and much of their trip is on the God's River, and so we'd sort of heard those tales and wanted to do it ourselves. And so we decided this was the summer to do it. We just sort of had to fill in the blanks of where we were starting and how we were going to connect to get to the God's River and then York Factory. And so we used the canoe atlas of the Little North quite a bit to connect some of those pieces. And so this just shows we were on the Severn River, and we wanted to make it up. You can see up there to Satchigo Lake First Nation to have our one re-outfit of food. And so the question was this area through here. And so we knew that it had been done before, but we didn't really know how well traveled it would be or how easy to navigate it would be. And so that was a bit of a mystery coming up. And so this is how it turned out to be. The trail was actually fine for most of it. So this is the end of the portage looking back to where the trail actually goes through that forest. So it was a couple of kilometers, and for the most part it was easy to follow, but then all of a sudden you come out of the forest and see what looks like endless bog. Like you really couldn't see any water. We couldn't see the closest place to put our boats in the water. And it's the kind of bog that when you're standing still, especially with a load on your back, you will sink. And if you sink, you drop your load, and then you're not getting up after that. And so it was sort of a mad dash for this last about 250 meters to get to the water. And you can see right here, those are actually the girls making their way to the end, so you can see how far it is. And this is them trekking through, desperate not to stop and take a break. So we did make it to the Rotten Fish River, and it actually was kind of how it sounded. It was really small and murky. There were a surprising amount of rotten fish on it. But what the biggest surprise were these giant log jams. Like every couple of turns throughout it, there would be these huge pileups of really big logs, like I think even 10 to 12 feet high sometimes. So we imagined that there were times earlier where big rushes of water had gone through and made all these trees pile up. But it led us to be needing to do a lot of little portages, cutting through pretty dense brush to get around all these log jams. But this one in particular, it wasn't too bad. It was one of the smaller ones. So we actually managed to kind of shift some of the logs aside and squeeze our boats through. So that's what the smiles are for. We were pretty happy that we didn't have to cut a portage on this one. So this gives you an idea of where our re-outfit is. So you can see we started at Windigo Lake, and then our re-outfit here at Sachigo Lake First Nation is about a third of the way through. And the only reason I've put a pig there is because the most important food that we resupplied with was our double-smoked slab bacon, which is a staple on our canoe trips. And so that was what we were looking forward to getting there. And you can see that the re-outfit's about a third of the way into the trip. And so the second leg of the trip, our loads were pretty heavy. And so we have a bit of a tradition of having a big feast the first night after re-outfitting with food to lighten our loads a little bit. And also by this point, by the time the girls get onto this trip, they're really good around the campsite, and they're very good wilderness chefs. I think this group in particular, they were really creative. And especially when we're out there for 7 weeks, you really don't want to be eating the same thing over and over again, so we got pretty creative. And this was one of their favorite meals, so they made lentil burgers, so they made the buns from scratch. We bring everything from scratch, and they made lentil patties, and then we've got some fresh French fries here and some donut holes for dessert. This is one of the many friends we made along the way. I could have put tons of pictures in, but I chose this one. But I find it neat on these trips when you're more surprised to see humans than you are to see this guy or his friends. And so we came to the Stall and the Red Sucker rivers, and the highlight on these was really the whitewater. Now, our approach to running whitewater on these trips is generally pretty cautious. You can see we're using wood canvas boats, which are not quite as resilient as some other boats you can take on whitewater. And also just being out for 7 weeks, you tend to be quite isolated, and so it's always in the back of our minds that help is pretty far away. So we want to be careful in terms of safety as well as in terms of keeping our gear safe. And the girls are very aware of that. They're sort of trained from that from the very beginning of their time at Keewaydin, and so they can be very anxious running whitewater, very nervous. But this was a cool part of the trip because they really kind of got into the swing of it, and they were really competent and confident in whitewater, and we were having a lot of fun on this section of the trip. really fun whitewater, not too much risk. And when we weren't able to actually run the rapids, the portages were, for the most part, on nice open rock like this, so it was pretty easy to do liftovers. This is on the Stall. Oops. Okay, and then we made it to the God's River, so the river that really inspired this trip for this summer. This was also a kind of a highlight of the trip because it's where our trip lined up with the Canoeing with the Cree adventure. So we'd been reading through every night, and this was where our trip actually lined up with where they were. So from this point on, we would paddle during the day and then read where they had been during that day and hear their stories of where we were in the same places. And we got a big kick out of that because some of them are pretty humorous. In particular, this rapid, you can see it on the right, we just finished it. And it's about 4 kilometers long, I think, from the beginning to the end. And so we did this rapid, and we had an interesting experience doing it. And when we read the story that Eric Severeid had told in Canoeing with the Cree, we got a big laugh about it because we'd had a very similar experience. He talks of speaking with some of the local First Nations people in the community just before this rapid, and they were all wanted to give advice, and a lot of them said, "Run it on the left, you must run it on the left," where others had said, "Definitely run it on the right, you have to run it on the right." And so they'd been confused, and we'd actually had the exact same experience. We didn't really ask anyone for opinions, but when we were there, they were really eager to tell us, but it told us completely opposite things. And so we got a big kick out of reading that adventure after. Okay, and it's so the Gods meets up with the Hays, and as Dave was saying earlier, they ran into some forest fire action anyway. And what's interesting, I found that really interesting to see his video earlier, because that must have been the raging fire that we had heard about and probably smelled the smoke from early in the summer. I think we came a little bit after, and you can see it here, and got the remnants of it. So we rounded a bend in the haze and saw that we could see the origins of all these little fires, and we could see that they were currently burning. We weren't really sure what that meant. We didn't know if there was a bigger fire further on or when these were going to end. But we'd had a little bit of forest fire experience from 2 years prior, where Lauren and I were leading a trip where a lot of smoke came through, completely covered the sky, and it was raining ash on us. You can see there are all these little charred pine needles. And so we made some calls to find out what was going on for the rest of our route, and it turned out that the rest of our route, so the 3 weeks we had to go, was either on fire or up in smoke. So we had to make a new plan. And luckily we were at a community at the time, Niskantaga, and so we had some help with making some arrangements, but we had to plan a whole new trip and didn't have the maps for it, so we were very creative, had to get creative for that one. So we had a little bit of experience. We weren't with fires, we were calm in this situation, but it was really interesting to be paddling by currently burning fires. And then we finally made it to the bay. So this really is what these girls have been working for 5 years. So when they first come to Keewaydin, they hear about the bay trip, and they hear from other campers about finally getting to the bay. So this was a really big moment for them, kind of everything that they'd been working for. And you can see the excitement on their faces after having finally reached it. And I like contrasting this photo with this one, because you saw the polar bear compound earlier. Here we are. Seems like the opposite of a zoo, right? Now, York Factory was a really cool place to end a trip, and you've heard a little bit about some of the history, but we really enjoyed being able to visit the original depot there. The rangers on site were really welcoming to us, got us set up in the polar bear compound, gave us some firewood, and gave us a great tour of the original depot there. They had a lot of knowledge about the history there. Not only was it one of the most important fur trading posts in Canada, but it was also a major immigration intake site for most of the central of Canada. So we really were sort of in awe of the history, the significance of where we were at this time. And it was towards the end of this tour that the lead ranger, Mike, said, "Oh yeah, look down, you might notice that we're replacing the floorboards of the original depot building here. Now you know where all the firewood came from that we gave you." And so our jaws kind of dropped to the floor when we realized that we'd been cooking our oatmeal and spaghetti over the 200-year-old floorboards from the original depot building. But we kept a little bit and brought it back with us. You'll have to excuse my map-making skills here. So the canoeing part of the trip was over, but we soon learned that the adventure was not done. So, of course, there are no roads and there's no airport at York Factory. So there are a couple of options to be able to get from York Factory to the town of Gillam, which is over this way, where we had a van waiting for us that was going to take us to a train. And so what we decided to do was hire a jet boat to take us from York Factory all the way around and up to Gillam. But there were two complications with this plan. One was that the jet boat could only take half of us at a time. And the other was that something that was new for us is having to plan around tides, because we were on the Hudson Bay. So there was a certain window that we could take this jet boat. So the plan we made was we had a set time that I was going to go with half of the girls. We would go first, take the jet boat to Gillam, stay there, and then my co-guide Lauren would come on the next tide with the second half of girls. We'd reunite in Gillam and then make our way back. But it was only about 10 minutes into that first jet boat ride where we were going right along the shore here because the jet boat driver wanted to show us the polar bears that he'd seen on the way over. So he was driving very close to the shore when all of a sudden we come to a full stop on a sandbar in the spot that he's trying to show us polar bears. And so he jumps out and he's trying to see if he can push the boat off the sand. And he is cursing away. And after he's done cursing, he looks over my shoulder towards the point here and says, "Oh, and there's a polar bear." And you can imagine that I'm in charge of all these girls. My heart is beating at this point. But the polar bear was pretty far away still at this point, and he was equipped with guns and things. So we were safe, but the problem was what to do next, because that boat was going to be stuck there for at least another 12 hours until the next high tide. But luckily, our cargo boat, which had been taking all our boats and wannigans, had left at the same time. And they saw that we got stuck, and they doubled back and came as close as they could to come rescue us and take us back to York Factory. But this involved we had to get deeper because the cargo boat had bigger props underneath and couldn't come in as shallow as we were. So we had to wade out into the Hudson Bay to be picked up by this cargo boat. So you can see the girls are very, they're calm as can be, just waiting in the ocean to get picked up. And this is the boat here that was just stranded, so we had to walk all that way to hop onto the cargo boat. And so we get taken back to York Factory. Everyone's safe, but the problem is we have one more tide to get all of us out of York Factory and to Gillam to meet our van, to catch our train, and to get back to camp on the day that we need to be. So this posed a bit of a problem. We had twice as many people still at York Factory that we needed to. So after going through all the options, made a ton of phone calls, spoke with the director of our camp, the best option was to hire a helicopter. So we brought in a helicopter, and so the helicopter took half of the group, went to Gillam, and then the other half went on the jet boat again once it was freed from the sandbar and met in Gillam, and that ended up being successful. You can see these girls are pretty excited about the surprise helicopter ride at the end of their canoe trip. And this is the photo that Lauren took from the helicopter of our stranded boat. So we were still in York Factory at this point. But we were redeemed a little bit. So when we got back in the jet boat and made our way over to Gillam, we got to ride very close up to a mother polar bear and her cub swimming in the bay. So that was pretty cool. That made up for it. And then I'll leave you with this. This was a quote that the girls picked out of Canoeing with the Cree, the book that we were reading every night. And I think it really, I like that they picked it out a lot because I think it really represents how they feel about canoe tripping. They understand that it's the challenges and the difficulties that make the rewards more valuable. And so that's it.